Chapter 10: The Game Development Process. There are a number of game development processes that we could explore. The nature of the process you come up with will depend on your values as a studio. Your actual development workflow should prioritize creating a good experience. A healthy approach to game development is iterative, collaborative, informed by other games without verging on plagiarism, and includes player voices. After stitching a few early ideas together, you'll be constantly building on a prototype, at times making additions or cuts to the design plans developed along the way. At the end, you'll have a finished product that's been through round after round of polish and testing, and one that's much stronger for it. Our focus throughout this chapter is exploring how we arrive at these kinds of processes, the methods you can employ to support their different components, and eventually, how you can develop one of your own. Chasing the light bulb. Before development starts, you need to have at least a very rough idea of your core experience, or a few different ideas to play with until you find one that sticks. But coming up with ideas is something you'll need to do throughout development, as you refine that core experience into a working game. And when problems arise, as they always do, coming up with creative solutions to those problems will have you back at the drawing board as well. There are a lot of different tactics you can employ here to come up with ideas, and none of the ones that we will be describing are mutually exclusive. Each of these tactics can serve as both a source of ideas and, far more valuably, a means to refine them into something that will contribute positively to the experience you create. Bouncing ideas off of colleagues is a great way to come up with an initial spark or solve a problem you're facing. Collaborative brainstorming is relatively easy to orchestrate successfully, assuming you take a couple of necessary steps to make sure that your sessions are productive. First, avoid dragging a huge number of people to an ideation session, and if you want to include more than 4 or 5 participants, split yourself into smaller groups so that everyone has a better shot at being an active voice. And make sure to reconvene after you've had a chance to speak in your groups. Other key measures to take here are honesty and equality. The point here is that your team should feel like they can say that an idea is terrible without hurting anyone's feelings or jeopardizing their future. One of the best ways to come up with a short list of ideas for a new game is to peer at what's already out there. This can be helpful if you have no idea of what to make, or even just a vague idea. One strategy you can use is to create a mood board. A mood board for game development might include screenshots, concept art, dialogue snippets, music clips, mechanic descriptions, and gameplay videos from games that inspire you. This can be particularly useful in shaping a game's aesthetics and atmosphere, though it can also serve to collect lots of intel on interactions via descriptions and video to help shape your design. More formally, looking at other games is the basis for competitive analysis. In short, competitive analysis involves looking at how other games accomplish some goal or another, learning from their successes and failings to create a solution that works for you. No matter what you're making, so long as you have an idea of your core experience, reaching out to find out what your players like and dislike about other games, and what their ideal experience looks like, will help inform your design. We should underscore the idea here that all of these tactics can be relevant throughout development, not just at the ideation stage. Interviewing players, looking to the real world for inspiration, or hammering out some ideas with your team are just as viable for developing individual features or improvements later in the production cycle. Follow the rulebook. Game production has evolved quite a lot since the first commercial games were created half a century ago. This evolution owes itself in part to technological advancements, such as cloud computing and the widespread availability of distributed version control. Arguably, a much stronger driving force behind this shift is a change in thinking about how people work. Understanding the human creative process and how ideas can transform themselves organically over time has helped to shift the conventions of the industry as a whole. We won't outline every major production structure here, instead boiling down most approaches into two major descriptors corresponding to more established and modern thinking, respectively. If there was one word to describe waterfall development, that word would be rigid. In its purest form, waterfall development means that there's no overlap between stages and certainly no hopping back and forth. Waterfall is linear, it's easy to understand, and it aims to wrap up the process of development with a neatly tied bow. The stages of development are concept, pre-production, production, post-production, release, and post-launch. Different sources might divide up these phases differently. A linear progression between these phases as described would be what you'd expect to see in a true waterfall approach to game development. When followed to the letter, waterfall development is inflexible. More forward-thinking game development has largely moved beyond the stoic linearity and aged mindset of a strict waterfall approach. Agile development's core value is flexibility. The underlying motivation of agile game development is to respect the highly iterative and collaborative nature of the creative process. It's hard to give an accurate procedural summary here, simply because agile development is itself a very general term. Here are the phases of a sprint, the fundamental unit of an agile development timeline. The planning phase, implementation, test, and review. The trick here is that each sprint lasts somewhere on the order of a week to a month. A full development cycle comprises dozens of sprints, instead of focusing on just a few linear stages. Each of these stages has a heavy focus on iteration, and there is often a far less defined boundary between them. Each stage is broken down into more manageable goals which are tackled in sprints. Agile development is quite fashionable in the tech industry, at least for the time being. Rewriting the rulebook. It should be obvious by now that a good game development plan will be flexible. Our official advice here is to avoid getting too caught up in a formal methodology, especially if you're a small team. Picking out some variation of agile development that seems like it would work well for your team is a great starting point. The only definite rule to keep in mind here is that you should be figuring out what works from experience and going with that. If you're looking for a starting point or some ideas to improve whatever you're already doing, we'll outline our vision for agile game development here. Stumble describes a process that you'll follow at a macro scale for your whole game up to launch. It's also something you'll follow on a micro scale for each new feature. In other words, it outlines both the course of development and the layout of a single sprint. You'll notice that there's no indication of timelines here, and that's by design. So complicated is the beast of game development that it would be foolish for us to suggest you need to spend specific days on specific things. As an estimate, our official suggestion for the length of a stumble sprint is 2 weeks, at least to start with. Let's get to it and look at each step you'll take with Stumble. Throughout this section, we'll be looking at methods that can help parts of the process where appropriate. Stage 0, the initial idea. This can occur at any time before you start working and often in the middle of working on something else. At the macro scale, your initial idea for a new game might spring up while you're working on another project, or you might sit down with your studio and brainstorm before taking up resources to start working right away. At the micro scale, the initial idea for a work item might come up early in development or while you're working on something else. At any rate, if you're strapped for ideas, try out some of the brainstorming techniques we discussed earlier in the chapter. Stage 1. Understanding your goals. This stage is where you dig into what you're trying to achieve when you're finished with whatever you're working on. A large part of this is understanding who the intended beneficiary of your work is. Usually this means understanding your target player, but not always. At any rate, here you should endeavor to understand their needs. consult your player persona, talk to any team members that will use your work, and scribble down a couple of quick user stories. Method: personas. A persona is a detailed description of a hypothetical person representing your target market. Usually, you'll create a couple different personas reflecting the diversity in experience, play habits, and likes or dislikes of your game's intended audience. The personas you create might be very specific or a bit more general. Bear in mind that your personas might evolve throughout development, and it's very beneficial to interview real people from your target audience if you can. Method: user stories. In general, user stories are short snippets describing the ideal version of a feature from a user's perspective. Archetypal user stories are often in the form of an "I want" followed by an explanation, packaging together a need that user has with a feature that fulfills that need. In games, we can speak of player stories, quick descriptions of gameplay or features from a player's perspective. Stage 2. Come up with alternatives. Here, you'll come up with a few very rough ideas of how you might approach what you're working on based on the requirements gathered in the previous stage. Your focus will be on identifying and selecting different design choices based on what you're trying to achieve. Competitive analysis is a fantastic tool at this stage to pick out ideas to try from games that have similar features. You might also create some extremely low-fidelity prototypes, depending on what you're working on. By the end of the stage, you should usually select just one alternative to proceed with. Sometimes, it might be necessary to take multiple ideas to prototype and evaluate before settling on one to develop fully. Method: digital prototyping. This is the most important tool in your little box of methods as a video game developer. The only real way to see if a design decision works is to test it in the form you expect players will experience your game, and that means creating digital prototypes. There are a few terms to be familiar with here. Fidelity describes how closely a prototype matches a finished game. A low-fidelity prototype uses pre-made or placeholder assets, probably plays pretty roughly, and only aims to capture a coarse idea of how something will feel. A high-fidelity prototype looks and feels more like the finished game or feature. Then there's verticality. A vertical prototype has a small scope, but lots of depth. A horizontal prototype, by contrast, covers a lot of different features, but with limited functionality and depth. Lastly, there's whiteboxing, which refers to roughing out the layout of a digital scene. In its purest form, whiteboxing uses untextured primitives to indicate the placement of things like walls, buildings, and so on. Stage 3. Planning. Make some notes in your living design documentation to convey your intent and your ideas for what the finished product of your work should look like. If you've been sketching, create a more detailed sketch. If you've been working on a low-fidelity prototype, refine that a little bit to better reflect what you hope to end up with. Figuring out how you're going to proceed is important, but don't spend too much time planning. Change is all but inevitable as you work. Method: living design documents. Design documentation is a necessity for keeping track of your decisions, setting a course for the future, and communicating with your team. Of much greater interest to an agile workflow is some form of living documentation, accessible and editable by all. For a small studio, this can be something as simple as a cloud storage folder with some documents, preferably with synchronous collaboration so that everyone can add in bits during meetings. For larger enterprises and more sophisticated efforts, you might consider setting up something like an online wiki for easier navigation of the complicated relationships between different aspects of your design. Stage 4. Implementation. This is where you make the thing, which might vary wildly in fidelity from the first iteration of something to a few polished tweaks on an already established part of your game. Prototyping techniques are your friend here, and remember that within the stage, you'll likely iterate on a small scale. If you feel like a small change is warranted, you don't always have to wait for testing to make that change, though you might want to consult with the rest of your team. Stage 5. Testing. The testing stage caps off your work, validating the design decisions you've made. More importantly, feedback from testing serves as a basis to determine your future work. Regular testing can and should be part of your process throughout development, and that includes the time where you've just barely scraped together an initial idea or a vertical slice of your game. On the whole, your priority during any development cycle should be working towards a vertical slice of your game as soon as possible, so that you can see if your core experience plays as you've hoped it would. Whenever you make the decision to add or tweak something, aim to prototype that functionality as soon as possible. That means that even if you're making your own game engine from the ground up, you should have a tool that you can use to prototype early in development or as a backup if you're waiting on any key technical features. Download a free commercial game engine and get to work. Prototyping is the only way to see if something is going to work in a finished game, so you always need to be ready to do it. Thank you for listening. Make sure to check out the book for more details on development processes. You can scan the QR code here to be taken to the store page. In the book, you will also find an exclusive interview with Ario, Head of Design for Player Experience at Roblox.